So my bit of a brief was just talk about my life and who I am, really. So it's going to be very informal and relaxed as I can do it. I spent 30 plus years as a cop, and I guess that's probably, I don't know whether they would be formative years. And I generally come to the conclusion that even in my policing career, there was no distinction as what, in churchy terms, you might call sacred and secular, because it was all God, really. And I look back and think, actually, the times I spent with cops that were going through tough times was exactly the same as I do now, wearing a formal chaplain uniform. So there was no difference. So a little about myself. I was born way back in the last century and was brought up in Sheffield. Any Sheffield folk or South Yorkshire folk? Yay! So I was born in Jessops, Sheffield, youngest of 4. There was a 10-year gap between me and the next youngest, and my brother, and then I had 2 older sisters. So I probably grew up thinking most of the time I was adopted, simply because I had very little contact with my sisters, who had kids when they were fairly young and had their own lives. My brother was still at home, but when I was 7, he was 17 and out playing rugby and mixing and doing all those things that teenagers do. So for much of my time I was just almost like an only kid, I guess. Very, in some ways, normal childhood. I went to a comprehensive school. My dad was a miner. All my sort of male relatives on my dad's side were from the mining background. My granddad, all my uncles worked down pit. And so it was in some ways a very rough area, but a very strong sense of community. Very close-knit together. Everyone knew everyone. If you were walking down the street, someone would say, "Hey, you're Dirk's kid, aren't you?" My dad was called Derek, but was known as Dirk. And it was like, "You're Dirk's kid." It was back in the day when you could go down and pick up your dad's wages. So on a Friday, when my dad was in the pub, he'd got up after nights, go to the pub. I'd get the task of walking down to the pit, going to the pay office and picking up his pay packet. I mean, can you believe it? I was probably 12, 13. Hey up, Nige. Make sure you get it all back to your dad. And that was the type of community it was. And it was just in many ways a great place to live up. We lived in an area, it was actually part of Rotherham, and it just bordered on open countryside. So if you went one direction, it was all towns and suburbs, and if you went the other way, it was open fields. And you had the great choice of whether you were going to hang around with your mates or just go off in the countryside and do what you wanted to do, or go into cause havoc in the local quarry, or set the farmer's wheat field alight, or all those types of things. So let me fast forward a bit to sort of 1980s, 1985 in particular. You'll remember the miners' strike. Really difficult time for my family. My mum had been diagnosed with cancer. She worked at a company called Welding Rods, and that's what they made, believe it or not. Welding rods. She worked in the lab there, testing the flux, but just a general factory worker, really. And whether it was work-related cancer, we never really found out. She went in for some surgery on her back, and they found that she had cancer and she had a few months to live. But at the same time, it was in the middle of the miners' strike, and it was a really tough time for the family. So my dad made the decision to go back to work, just really to put some money into the household income to try and give mum a few months quality of life without having to worry about costs. And that was really, really challenging. I remember middle of the night, the police bikes and cars coming down, and then the coaches with, I think they were hastily welded on metal bread baskets on the windows to stop them being smashed. And used to turn up, they'd phone Dad and say, "Oh, we'll be there at 2:30. And they'd come down, and my dad would get on the coach to go to the pit. Not that they actually went down, because there weren't enough people to work down the mine safely for a lot of the time. So they just ended up being at work. But during that period, I personally had a lot of encounters with the police. If you were walking to a mate's, you would often be stopped and searched, just because there was a lot of antagonism between those that had gone back to work, those that hadn't gone back to work. And so the police would just stop and search you, turn you over, look at your shoes. I don't know why they looked at your shoes, but that's what they said. That's vivid memory. Maybe they were looking for someone in particular with a footprint of whatever. And I remember that, and I thought, actually, I had a lot of respect for those cops. I'd just finished my A-levels that summer, and I remember seeing all the news coverage and thought, do you know what, I'm going to go to Orgreave. And so I caught the bus to Orgreave and found myself on a bridge over a railway line. I mean, if you went there now, you would never know that there was a coking plant there at all. It's completely changed. And looked out over the fields to the main road that went sort of from Rotherham to Sheffield, and behind it was Orgreave, the coking plant, where there was loads and loads of battles, really, between miners and the police. And I watched all this unplay, almost like a medieval battle of the miners running forward and the cops pushing them back, and then they'd bring in the horses. And it was just like, for me as a 18, 19-year-old, just fascinating to see that. And so I ended up going to university. And at that time, they had a big recruitment drive for special constables, which is volunteer police. Exactly the same powers, but you just don't get paid. And so when I wasn't at uni, I would choose to spend some time doing that. 1985, in the summer, my mum died. I moved away. And so my dad was really pretty much left alone. And knowing now what I know about grief and trauma, it's no surprise to me that my dad hit the drink really hard. Not only had he lost his wife, but the only other family member, me, had moved away from home. His work colleagues were all moving away to find jobs. The businesses that were in the village were closing down, and the sense of community was going. They call it systemic loss, and you can grieve over things like that. And my dad was part of that. He was grieving over the loss of the community. I mean, the wonderful thing was, because it was a community, people knew why my dad went back to work. And so he never really got the hassle of those, rightly or wrongly, that were persecuted for going back to work and breaking the strike. And my dad had that respect, that they knew he'd gone back to try and put some food on the table. I could go back even further. One of my earliest memories, and whether I remember it or whether I was told it, was one in the previous miners' strike in the 1970s, when I was really, really young, going with my pushchair with my dad onto the slag heaps, picking up bits of coal to put on the fire. And apparently we were chased by the local policeman off the slag heap. Now, I can't remember that, or whether a family member told it me, really, but I just think it's really interesting that I ended up going into a career in policing, with so many encounters. And times were tough. I'm blessed. I have a police pension and a salary from the charity that I work for, and financially we're comfortable. But I've also been through those tough times, particularly in those miners' strikes, where there wasn't a lot of money and there wasn't food to put on the table. Going down to the butchers and saying, "Have you got any dripping to bring home?" And that's what they used to do. They say, "Yeah, sure." Everyone knew each other, and if they had a bit of, they'd wrap it up, and you used to come over and have toast with dripping on for your dinner, and it's like just the way it was. Or I remember often staying with my grandma and granddad, and we had, I don't know whether it's a thing these days, but they used to soak cucumber and onions in vinegar. And we used to have that as a sandwich for dinner. I mean, they were not great times. And going to the fish and chip shop and say, "Have you got any scraps?" I mean, it sounds like an absolute orphan, but I just, that was life for me. So I think I've seen the tough times emotionally and maybe financially through my parents, but also the good times as well. So after uni, I met my wife, Heather, at uni. We were down together in Plymouth, and that's where I served with Devon and Cornwall Constabulary as a special. I spent a year trying to get in the police. It was actually fairly tough. Back then we were living in North Yorkshire, and I didn't get in North Yorkshire. So I tried West Yorkshire and was accepted basically within a week of applying. So clearly my name and face didn't fit in North Yorkshire. Maybe they looked at my National Coal Board heritage and thought, he's not going to fit in North Yorkshire. So yeah, and my first posting was actually to Leeds in Wheatwood, which I think now is about to close. Wheatwood Police Station, just off the Ring Road at Lawnswood there. And really, I could regale you with so many stories about policing. I am going to tell a few because they're pretty humorous. Yeah. So I always remember the story of my first arrest. You know, there are times in policing where you have those little moments. Most of it just blurs into the homogeneous of life of policing and the routine of it. But there are those key moments that stand out. And of course, your first arrest, you know, shiny-faced, creases in your shirt. Back in the 80s, you know, we had a lump of wood in our pockets. That's the only thing that we had, our truncheon. Pocketbook, and that was about it. You could go out on duty with just those things. Sometimes you remember to pick up your handcuffs and slip them in your pocket. Often not. My first arrest was on the Avenue in Leeds, very posh area of Leeds, and there was a really nice clothes shop, ladies' clothes shop, that sold designer clothes. And we had a report, burglar alarm sounding, suspect seen making off in a dress. So I thought, this is easy enough. So there I am in the passenger seat of the police car, which back then was a little Ford Fiesta. Little noddy light on the top, no sirens, that was about it. So we were driving along the avenue, and sure enough, there's this fella, hairy legs, pair of trainers on, wearing a dress. So my tutor nudges me and said, "Get him." So, of course, I lock him up. Remember the caution. You don't have to say anything. It may harm a defence if you fail to mention. All that sort of stuff. And he says, "What are you picking on me for? I've done no." And you think, really? You know, you're within about 200 metres of the shop and you're wearing a dress that is clearly missing from the doll in the window. And you're saying, "Why are you picking on me?" Well, that's pretty much like policing. Often, whatever the evidence, it's like, "It had nothing to do with me, mate." And it's like, that was like, okay, I see that now. And then you could go into all sorts of cultural stories about blame and guilt, culture and shame, and why often, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, people will still deny it because the culture that they're from is pretty much honour-based. And that really is a barrier to them saying, "Yeah, it was me. Hold my hands up," because the last thing you want to do is bring shame on the family. Yeah, so back then, you probably spent the first 8 to 10 years learning the trade of being a cop before you specialise. Now, it's like 2 weeks and you're already showing someone else the ropes. And my specialism was roads policing. I was a traffic cop, and I know they're probably not your most favourite type of cop, but that was my chosen career. I loved it. In fact, I loved it so much that actually I did it for probably 17, 18 years without ever thinking I'd want to change from that role. And fairly late on in my service, probably 23, 24 years, I thought I ought to do my sergeant's exam, really. So I did that and passed it and was qualified and did periods of sergeant duties. But for the most part, it was on the coalface, dealing with everything that traffic cops deal with. I think in the hierarchy of cops, traffic cops are probably up there, certainly within the policing culture, with firearms officers. So within the hierarchy I mean, members of the public, I'm sure, don't look at it this way. I really don't know. But in policing, it's like if you are a firearms officer, you're the Gucci squad. Yeah, you know the firearms officers because they're the ones that wear at least one size too small in the t-shirts. Never wear a coat even when it's raining, and their arms are out like this. But traffic cops and firearms officers vie for each other as where they fit, really. I was sharing with Alan as we drove across it. The famous line from traffic cops is, as you wind the window down that much and you find out at a scene that it's nothing to do with traffic, is, I'll leave it with you, kid. And then you drive off. That is the famous line. And then a little below that, you have the dog officers that also are pretty much Gucci. They're pretty hard cops are the dog officers. And then you've got the mounted section. And then below that, you've got the ID. Okay. The ID are like the lowest of the low. So for me, anyone who's old enough to remember Dad's Army, you remember Dad's Army? And there's Pikey with his little fag, always. That for me is the archetypal detective, particularly when I was learning my trade in Leeds, because they always had a little fag in their mouth and they always wore gold jewellery. That was just traffic cops. And then you had the beat, which is actually the hardest job in policing. But the general response cops. And just like now, they have the hardest job because they go to everything. They'll deal with dog fouling and littering, to first on the scene of a terrorist incident, to murders, to industrial accidents, to fires. They're the first that turn up and are expected to know everything, all the legislation that covers everything from dog fouling to terrorism, and know how to deal with it. And that's probably the toughest job in the world. Within my policing, I specialised in traffic. And although I used to love the pursuits, the fast driving, the nice cars that we had, we started off with pretty crap cars really in traffic. We had the Sierra 2 litres, we had the Cavalier SRIs, and they're pretty naff. And then as crime advanced, we had to keep pace with them, so we got those Astra GSIs and Sierra 4x4s. And when I went in roads policing, we had Volvo T5s, which is a really nice car. But then we found out they weren't agile enough for policing around town. Trying to turn them around was like trying to turn around a oil tanker. The doors are that thick you could put a plant pot on the windowsill. It's that wide and that big. Really good for putting your coffee. And as an advanced driver, you could just leave it there and drive along and you wouldn't spill. But yeah, those are the vehicles that we had. Then we went to the Skoda VRSs, which were really nice. Actually, I had a VRS that ran away from me. I was at a crash in Idle. A pedestrian had been knocked down just by Bargain Motor Spares in Idle, if anyone knows that. And I'd had a long drive to get there and park the car. And back then there were manuals, and pulled the handbrake on. There about an hour and a half, 2 hours, collision investigator had turned up, and then my car slowly rolls through the scene, down the hill. And the collision investigator shouts, "You can't." But there was nothing I could do, and it went slowly down the hill and crashed into the back of a van. Fortunately, the guy whose van it crashed into, I dealt with a crash that he was in the week before on his motorbike, and he was quite happy with how he'd been dealt with, so it wasn't a big deal. But they found out that as the discs had cooled from the fast driving and hard braking, they'd contracted, and we couldn't leave it in gear back in those days. Like we had the KRS system, which meant you could take the keys with you, but of course you couldn't leave it in gear, so it had just rolled down the hill. But anyway, that links me to the specialism within roads policing, which is a family liaison officer. So often you'll will read or hear on the news that specialist officers have been appointed to support the family. That was my role. It was my role to go and visit a family when someone was killed and break the news to them of the death of their loved one. And often that would be the identification, so finding out who was the driver or who was the passenger of the vehicle that had died, and then trying to establish positively as best we could that was the person who had died, and then delivering that news to the family. So bearing in mind that I've done this for 22 years, there's probably not much in terms of collisions that I'd not dealt with, really, from children, pensioners, kids, lots and lots of teenagers, because they're the most vulnerable road groups, both as pedestrians and as vehicle users. And so I was as well used to dealing with death. Often, because of your skills, you'd be asked to go to house fires or industrial accidents, because the same process was needed, identifying the deceased, locating the family, delivering the news. And certainly within roads policing, the part that I was most impactful on my career was the support that you gave to family afterwards. So the family liaison officer is there to communicate with the family, updates about the investigation, return of property, release of the deceased for burial, all those things, all the way through until trial, whether that's a coroner's inquest or even magistrate, Crown Court if there's a defendant. So you were with the family for sometimes 12 months, 18 months, later in the service because the court process slowed down. Sometimes it was over 2 years. And that became in itself really challenging, because often you would spend far more time with the family, getting to know the deceased, hearing their stories. Part of the process was taking a victim impact statement, which was about the personal loss on their lives. So you'd hear firsthand the impact of the death upon the family and the family members. So it often became quite difficult to separate some of the things that you're hearing from the day-to-day investigation techniques, because the family often viewed you as a friend. Often there'd be no faith involvement, there was no clergy, and there was a real absence of support for bereaved families. I mean, I'm going back, to the 2000s and earlier than that. It was very different then as it is now. And often they would look to you as a professional for all sorts of advice, not necessarily policing advice, but what do we do? How do we tell? Do we let the kids go and see mum at the funeral home? All sorts of stuff that they would ask you, because you were the only person there really that perhaps had any great experience of dealing with death. And so that in itself took some working through, and I developed an interest in trauma and grief and resilience and how to cope with that. And in a sense, that was really good. And it sounds like it's really depressing. And of course, most of the time, policing is depressing. You don't get a cop knocking on your door to tell you you've won the lottery. Middle of the night, a cop's on the door. It's always bad news. But there are those humorous bits. I'm just going to lighten it a little bit. Yeah, there's those horrible bits, but there are those humorous bits. And of course, most of those are your work colleagues. Yeah, there are idiots in policing and they wear uniform. And we trust them to do the job. I say they, because I'm retired 4 years. But I used to work with a guy called Trevor. Great guy, really, really friendly, really nice. He was in traffic. Could he drive? No. His previous occupation was a bus driver. So you're driving along on patrol and it was constantly. People used to decline going out with him because it's like, being on the number 96 bus, he'd insist on stopping every 20 minutes. It was like, Trevor, what are you doing? I just need to stop and have a rest. Okay. Trevor was often the butt of jokes as well, unfortunately. Call it bullying? I don't know. One of the ones I always remember is that someone found, those little jingle bells, Christmas little sound, maybe 3 bells. Well, they hooked them on the back of his little bag that he carried around with him with his sandwiches in and his notebooks and all. And so he got back one day and he said, I've heard these bells all day. And he was walking along the crowd with these bells jingling. He was the funniest guy. He was the guy that when he was sat doing paperwork, he'd be so engrossed writing or typing that someone would get his handcuffs that were on his utility belt and wrap them round his chair so that when he stood up, the chair was attached to him. So poor old Trevor. That was the type of story. And there's the humorous stuff as well. I remember one story, and it's travelled around the policing world, really, about an officer, a dog officer, a dog handler, who made an arrest. And he put his statement in saying he'd arrested this burglar, let's call it a burglary suspect. And he was assisted by PD Sabre, police dog Sabre. So he put the file in. Crown Prosecution Service sent it back saying, please could PD Sabre provide a statement regarding the arrest. So the dog handler said, for operational reasons, accurate, PD Sabre cannot submit a statement. Sent it back. Comes back. Second request, please request PD Sabre submit a statement. Again, sent it back. Operational reasons, it cannot provide a statement. So, final request, please, PD Sabre must provide a statement or this case will not progress to court. So the dog handler thought, I know what I'll do. I'll do the statement from police dog Sabre. So it was, Dad said, get bad guy. I chased, I bit. And put a dog paw on the statement and sent it in. Well, if you read any police magazines, or anything like that, this story's gone around the globe now. So there is humour in that, and it's a good thing. Sometimes it's a little bit dark, often inappropriate, and particularly when you're on a closed motorway and there's no one there, and it's horrendous, and it's raining, and you've got body fragments. Humour creeps in. And it just lightens the moment. And sometimes we know it's inappropriate, and trying to get cops to remember that nowadays people have long-distance cameras or there's a drone there, and you sat there on the barrier waiting for the funeral directors to come, sharing a joke isn't appropriate. But that's the reality of it. Sometimes it happens as well. So let me just move a little bit of a story on. As time went on, you become so used to doing what you do that it becomes second nature. And that's how I find my policing story moving. Because I was working so regularly with the bereaved, it was just the normal for me, and I didn't really think a lot about it. During all this time, my faith was important to me. I came to faith when I was about 13, 14. My brother lived in Cornwall, and my parents shipped me off down there, and I went to a beach mission, really wide games and capture the flag and all sorts of stuff that was great for young kids. And it was probably run, I'm guessing, by university students that were there in the summer. And they used to do these games, and then they'd bring you all together and they'd share a story. But what really struck me, and if I'm honest, probably more than the stories, which were often Bible stories, was actually there was something different about these young people. There was something about how they interacted with each other. They had a sort of a different respect, a different perspective on life, a different worldview. And it was that really attracted me. And back then, they probably gave what a church would call a traditional gospel message. They shared the story about this is how you can go from living your life, how it can be transformed, how it can be changed, it can be renewed through putting your faith in Jesus. And I thought, well, that sounds okay, but actually I want to be like you. You know, I knew what teenagers were like. I knew what my brother was like. He was already had 2 kids by this stage. He was already into his first marriage and his second affair. I could see what life was like. I remember being with his first wife, again, probably the year before this encounter with these young people, not knowing any better, went out to the pub as a probably 12-year-old then, with his wife, who had 2 young kids and me, in a Ford Anglia, driving down a Cornish country road, completely drunk, and we ended in a ditch. So I knew that there was something, there were consequences to life, even as a young teenager. And so I decided to actually put my trust in Jesus. And I think the language that would probably use is, I was saved. And I didn't really understand what saved meant, because I thought, saved from what? But I knew I liked this lifestyle. And it was that drew me in. And then later, through my later teenage years and at uni, my faith deepened. It wasn't always a steady walk. Made loads of mistakes, loads of mess-ups, not good in relationships. But within me, there was that drawing me back to which I'd seen, the lifestyle, and then at the same time, the difference that Jesus actually made. And it made sense that actually it was the deeper that you went with Jesus and the relationship that you had was the reason that I could see the difference in the lifestyles of those young people that had attracted me in the first place. And so then I started thinking, actually, how do I deepen my life, my walk with Jesus? And through these challenging times of policing, dealing with loss and bereavement and grief, my faith was really important to me because it made sense of the stuff that made no sense. You lose count of the times you go and think, how on earth did these 2 vehicles end up on this piece of road at the same time with this consequence? A second earlier, second later, it wouldn't have happened. And the why question is really important. And I don't have the answers to the why question. I'll put that out there right now. Why is the pain? Why is the death? Why is the grief? Why is the divorce? Why is the financial struggle? Why is the war? I don't have the answers to the why question. But I know that the why question is important. And I realized that I needed to find a way of working through that why question. I remember delivering the news to a family of a guy who'd been killed on his motorbike. I think I was covering the motorway, which is where I normally worked, on the M1 or the M62. And they said, could you go into Wakefield district, which means in one of the cities somewhere, can you deliver the death notification? And so I went to this terraced house in Wakefield and broke the news that her son had been killed on this motorbike. And in the same breath, literally the same breath, she said, what has happened? Why? And I realized that lots of people carry that why question. It's a really important question to come to terms with in life. Now, I'm saying I don't have all the answers. Theologians have worked through this. They call it theodicy. How does the all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God exist? And yet we have suffering in the world. And we ask those questions. We see it on the news daily, hourly. I think all of us, whether we have faith or not, have to be in a position where we can give some kind of response, to have worked it out, even if it's not complete, for ourselves. Because at some point, you will be faced with that why question. Because I was. So I've shared that, I dealt with everything. Towards the end of my service, I retired in 2019, we were coming through the latter stages of austerity. Policing numbers had been cut by over 20,000. Specialist officers like roads policing officers had cut. I went through at least 2 job reviews where you had to apply to be in your role again. The only way I can say it is that the best got through. Those that were less good didn't. And so we went from having, for example, on the motorway, 5 teams of 10 officers with 2 sergeants. So 10 officers patrolling the motorway on each shift every day. By the time austerity had finished, we had no officers covering the motorway. We were all based back at district, and you had to drive up to the motorway to patrol it, and were called off into division to deal with city centre crashes all the time. So as a family liaison officer, many of those family liaison officers had been cut. So rather than perhaps dealing with maybe 3, 4 bereaved families in a year, you were suddenly dealing with 4 or 5 at the same time. So just as soon as you'd complete one and one to be dealt with at coroner's or Crown Court, you'd have another one starting. And there was no let up. And just as how policing is, sometimes the latter ones, certainly in the last 2 or 3 years of my service, were pretty much all young people, teenagers. And those are the ones that get to you. It's always a tragic loss. But for a younger person or a child, it's heartbreaking because they've got the whole future. And although, an elderly person dies, people are heartbroken, and I'm not sort of mitigating that or minimizing that. But for young people and kids, it's always more difficult. I remember dealing with just about every type of road death you could. But one that caught me out was the death of an unborn child. That was the first time that I'd, probably in 22 years of being a traffic cop, that I'd dealt with the death of an unborn child. And it's horrible, the whole thing. I went through a red light at a junction by unlicensed, uninsured driver. Mum, who's got life-threatening injuries, has to give birth naturally because they can't do the normal medical interventions because of her life-threatening injuries. So she has to go through childbirth knowing that the child is dead. While I'm with the husband, having to do the necessary process of the form that we need to submit to the coroner. In West Yorkshire, we call it the Form 49, coroner's report of a sudden or unexpected death. So being with Dad, and of course name of deceased is the first question. Have you thought about a name for your baby? Asking that to the father. And then of course realising that actually now the baby's died, they might want to call the baby something different, a different name. And of course the professional mask goes on, torn up with emotions inside, absolutely heartbroken for the family, but you're there as a professional and the mask goes on. Yes, being caring and empathetic and showing sympathy, all those things that a good family liaison officer does, but actually broken inside, but maintaining that professional exterior. And I went back to the station. The child was born, stillborn. I went back to the station and was typing up the report to the coroner. The other officers were working on different aspects of the report. And I'm typing it up from my notes, and I get to enter date of birth and then date of death. And of course it was the same. And of all the Form 49s that I'd done ever in my police service, that was the first time that I'd ever had to put the date of birth and the date of death as being the same. And I just said, I just need to step out. And I went out, Trafalgar House Police Station, probably, 2 o'clock in the morning, and just walked round. Just get some fresh air and clear my head, because it was burning me inside, just the horror of, this stupid idiot driver showing off to his mates in Halifax, goes through the red light, devastates a family, takes the life of the child. And within that, I think probably it's the first time that I sensed, although I wasn't conscious of it at the time, it's only looking back, it's the first time that I sensed rage within me. Absolute anger, that if I could get hold of that young lad, justice would be served, but not in the way that the courts would, if you get my drift. And for a cop, that is, for me as a cop, that's not the way that I did things. I would talk my way out of a fight. Very rare that I went hands-on with anyone. There are cops that turn up at stuff and you think, oh no, it's going to get worse. And there are those that come and bring a little bit of peace. I was one of those that generally people were pleased to see because of what I carried. I would be a calming influence on both cops and those that were looking to do ill. And that one triggered memories of another fatal that I dealt with on the M1, where a bride and groom had been killed on the wedding night. And it sort of opened a floodgate of probably all the collisions that I dealt with and professionally dealt with, and been really supportive of the families, but had put up that professional mask, that had put all the feelings, the emotions, the pain, the anger, the grief that I'd picked up from them. Technically, they call it vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. I just put it to one side and not dealt with it and processed it. And during this period of time, I certainly wasn't getting any better. And I went to a collision in Shipley. I was covering the motorway as I think I was out Ainley Top near Huddersfield, Halifax, and a report of a collision came in on Valley Road at Shipley. Pedestrian and a truck. Turned out to be a 2-year-old child. And so I knew that as the family liaison officer working on the team, I would be needed. So without being sent, which is often the way officers respond because they know they're going to be needed. And I turned up at Valley Road in Shipley, 2-year-old child, run over by a tipper truck. He'd managed to get out of the garden on a ride-on toy and was killed. Young Isaac Brocklehurst was his name. And one of the roles of the family liaison officer is to ask the family if they have a photograph that they would like to be released to the press. Now, this is one of the tough jobs that family liaison officers do. It's the unseen side of policing. On the day or the day after a death, to ask a family if you've got a photograph of your loved one that, on your behalf, through our police press department, we can release to the media. Well, why do I want to do that? Well, they will find out where you live and they will come and pest you for a photograph. Or these days, they'll go to an open source medium like Facebook or Twitter and just take the photograph. And you might not want that photograph to be used. Of course, for young people, social media is full of photographs. So, Mum, and I could have brought the picture and had it up there because it was the one that was in the TNA. Young Isaac Brocklehurst, 2 years old, sat on a train journey, looking out the window, and the window was slightly misty. Well, that image became what I know now was an intrusive image for me. As I started becoming unwell towards the end of my police career, I saw that image in my sleep. I also saw it when I was awake. And I know now that was a sign of post-traumatic stress injury, sometimes called post-traumatic stress disorder. And it was just one of those images that was there. But you know me, I was strong. I'd done this for 22 years as a roads policing cop, 30 years as a cop almost. I was within a year of retirement. I'd not been sick probably in over 20 years. My last time I was off sick was when I had my vasectomy. And there was all this pride within me, all this thought, I can see the finishing line in front of me, run the race that's before me, have that last day, the things that cops look forward to, the last blast in the police car, the writing of the last ticket, putting your uniform in the locker, bagging it up, sending it away, handing in your warrant card on your last day, coming in on afternoon shift, because you normally finish on afternoon shift, having a cup of tea and a slice of cake, and then the sergeant saying, well done, off you go home early. Those were the things that were in front of me that I wanted to achieve. I wanted to finish well. I didn't want to go sick. And so I carried on, going through the motions, still being exposed to more and more trauma. And then I went to a potential fatal again. I was covering on the motorway. Horrendous winter's day, pretty much like we had yesterday. Rain and gales, somewhere in Halifax. I think it was South Harram, so Bradford, Halifax border. Report of a pedestrian knocked over. Made my way from the motorway. Now, getting from the motorway through rush hour traffic in Halifax and Ellen to get to South Harram is pretty much stressful enough, but dealing with a potential fatal elderly lady knocked down, turned out she had a hood up, had a quick glance to cross the road and set off with purpose. She'd not seen the car that was coming and she'd just stepped out in front of it. And for me, it was just like a routine investigation. Collision investigation were there, securing CCTV, taking statements, breathalyzing the driver, initial account at the roadside. All those things were just normal. So you're there maybe 4 or 5 hours. At the end, I'm walking through with my torch, just checking the scene, making sure we've not missed anything. And on the edge of the curb, I found a tooth that had been knocked out. Actually, it was a set of dentures, and they'd been fractured, so there was maybe 3 or 4 teeth in the plastic pink bit. So I popped them in an evidence bag, spoke to the collision investigator, said, yeah, the scene's clear, and we'll reopen the road. So that was it. So it's now about 11 o'clock at night. Called from McDonald's on my way back because I've not had a meal. Went into the station and had my Big Mac in one hand. And in the other hand, I have my evidence bag with the false teeth that I'm booking into property. And I suddenly look as I'm typing and I had this moment of realization. Nigel, how has this become normal? That you can sit eating your Big Mac while counting the number of teeth to put it accurately down on the property report and searching for false teeth on the computerized drop-down list. And I'm thinking, this is just crazy. How is this normal? Anyway, at the same time, because it was in fairly close proximity to young Isaac being killed, we were offered support to go and speak to someone from our occupational health unit. So I said, Sarge, I think I'd like to go and speak. So I went to see this lady and told her all the things I'd been experienced. And within my notes, I've got a great big list of symptoms that I'm not going to bore you with now. But they fell into behavioral, emotional, relational, psychosomatic, cognitive, the way that you think, and spiritual. And I realized that actually my faith had been shaken. I was thinking, and I'd not consciously verbalized this to Jesus. I'd not sort of said, where are you in all this? I'd not been going to him to give me the strength to get through it or to actually effectively work through the things that I was seeing. And so if I just look at I have to take my glasses off because I'm that age. If I look at the spiritual aspect, these are the symptoms of post-traumatic stress. In the spiritual realm, it's questioning life's meaning. A sense of persuasive hopelessness, anger at God, questioning of prior religious beliefs, loss of faith in a higher power. So although my faith hadn't gone, I realized that I was in a place of saying, God, where are you in this? And it was a real tough thing, because as a person of faith that has a relationship with Jesus, who has seen his life, my life, transformed from what it was to what it was then, I mean, God, why are you allowing this? Why now? Everything else in life was absolutely perfect. Well respected, probably the most experienced traffic cop, really appreciated at work, great family, kids had gone through uni. We were just about to clear the mortgage. I'd already had the offer of a full-time job with the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. I knew exactly where I was going after retirement. And yet I'm feeling low, down, not sleeping. The physical symptoms were heart palpitations. I used to drive from where I live in Idle to Trafalgar House in Bradford, the police station. And as I dropped down King's Road onto Shipley Airedale and started coming back up towards where Christians Against Poverty used to be, my hands started to sweat. And I would grip the steering wheel and I could feel this sort of pain inside. Anyway, try and bring the story to some kind of conclusion for you. The occupational health referred me to a therapist. And so I was availed of lots of sessions with this therapist. It was actually really very good. She wasn't a person of faith, but she helped me explore the faith response into what I was trying to work out. But one of the biggest obstacles for me, and by now the doctors had diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder and depression with anxiety. The biggest thing for me is that I would not go sick. Because I would not go down the route of taking antidepressive medication, antidepressants. Because I didn't want to go, I didn't want to be labelled as that Christian cop who couldn't finish work. I didn't want to be labelled, and none of my faith family from church would ever say this, a disappointment because you've gone sick. But within me, that's what I was thinking. Root cause, if I'm honest, pride. I had this picture that I had of myself, my career, identified as a cop. I taught grief and trauma. I was volunteering. Actually, I was freelance for Billy Graham, teaching classes about grief and trauma. And I didn't want to be associated with someone who was actually impacted by that. So although offered this wonderful counselling, I did it in duty time. So I used to go in my X5, turn up at the counsellors, beautiful place just on the way into Huddersfield on the right-hand side as you come down from Ainley Top, one of those really big houses, beautiful place. Park my police car there, take off my body armour, sit in a comfortable chair and talk through all the issues. And I actually think, I actually feel normal. And then, okay, great session. It's been a great hour and a half, Nigel. See you next week, same time. And then I'd put on my body armour again, get back in the police car, and then go and expose myself to all this trauma all over again. Because my pride wouldn't let me go sick. So eventually what happened, I went to an officer's leaving do, and there was an officer who was actually off sick, meeting with his team at this leaving do, and he'd been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, and he knew that I was still working, and I was saying, this is how I'm feeling, and I'll not use the language that he used, but he said, Nigel, you are a bleep idiot. Get yourself sorted before you retire, because otherwise you'll carry this with you through the rest of your life. And maybe because I'd probably had one too many shandies that evening, I heard him. And so the following day, I phoned in sick. And I made an appointment with the doctor and went on those antidepressant medications and went to the counsellor without having to go back to work. And I, as quickly, although my descent had been like a slow, steady descent into where I found myself, once I'd recognised that I needed to change and that I had to take responsibility for myself getting well, not being pig-headed, not being proud, not being Nigel, the traffic cop, not being Nigel, the guy who works for Billy Graham. That slow descent actually became a rapid recovery. And I saw God at work in that. And although I still had those questions, I recognised that actually that recovery was pretty much miraculous, looking back. It didn't seem it at the time because it was a tough slog being off sick. It was hard work because I just wasn't used to it. I'd spent years working. But actually that time meant that I could recover, and I recovered quickly. Once those root causes of the pain I was facing had been identified, once I'd worked it through, once I'd had the space to give thoughts to those why questions, my faith took me to the next level. And I can't say it was all God. I had a responsibility within it as well. So recapping, there was a disconnect in my faith. I had a really strong foundation and was rooted, but that had been shaken. Fellas, it's okay to be shaken. It's okay to say, I'm not comfortable with this. Things aren't right. My relationship isn't right with my kids, with my parents, with my wife, whatever it might be. It's okay. My friendships aren't right. I'm going to the wrong places for the support. Maybe it's alcohol. Maybe it's pornography. Maybe it's drugs. And I know those are the places we go to because for momentarily they give us some comfort. But actually, I realize that there is a greater help in the person that I know as Jesus. I'm not talking about church. I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about an encounter with the person of Jesus. Who, even when we can't give the answer to the why, there's a who. Who can help me? Who can help me get out of bed today? Who can give me the strength to carry on? Who can motivate me? Who can give me a reason for living? Because I had those suicidal thoughts too. And I teach about suicide. Suicidal thoughts are really serious. Suicidal thoughts where you've thought about how you're going to take your own life, that is the place where there's a really serious intervention needed. And I thought about that. And that's a really horrible thing to have to say. But if it's helpful for someone here, those thoughts are so common, particularly among men. I knew exactly how I would take my life and when. I did planned out because I couldn't see a way out. I didn't like the person I'd become at that moment. But things can change. There is hope. There is a difference. There is new life. There's new possibilities. How I felt then was in the moment. Part of the thing about post-traumatic stress injury disorder and depression is that you find yourself in this space where you can't see yourself out of the hole that you're in. But there is always hope. And to be honest, there's loads of crap out there too. People come along with little statements, scripture even. People might say, well, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. If you're in that dark place, it certainly doesn't feel like that. Romans 8:28. All things work together for good for those that are called by God. Doesn't feel like that. And we have to be real. We have to be honest. What doesn't kill you gives you a lot of unhealthy coping mechanisms and a dark sense of humour. That's what I found. But my relationship with Jesus was part, and it was a key part, of what I call 5 smooth stones. If you're familiar with the story of David and Goliath, he has to face an enemy. He goes to a beck. He picks up 5 smooth stones to defeat the enemy. But he only needed 1. For me, I needed 5. I needed all 5. So the first one was trying to be rooted in my faith, meditation, prayer, scripture, worship music. To be honest, trying to read scripture was a waste of time. I could read a passage, I could read a book, I could read a commentary, and it just wouldn't go in. For me, it was listening to the music that had meaningful, powerful words within it that ministered to my soul. And if you know the Psalms, you know that's exactly what happened to David, that he needed someone to minister to him. My second one was fellowship. And within that, I would view my close church friends, those that knew me, those that I could learn to be honest with. And also family, my wife, Heather, and also, if I'm honest, my therapist. And the other 3, mindfulness, breathing, relaxation techniques. If I'm honest, yoga was part of that. I'm in a church and I've said yoga, horrible. Well, look at me. I'm over 6 foot. I am not designed for yoga. But doing yoga with the yoga instructor telling me how to get this particular shape or exercise took all my mental processing, that the thoughts that were crowding my mind just stopped for an hour. And it helped me. And actually, some Christians have actually said, Nigel, you want to be really careful with yoga. It's from the dark side. And I'm thinking, oh, get real. Come on. And exercise and medication. And I recovered really well. So my relationship with Jesus was key. And my fellowship was key. And I went to a different place in realizing what accountability really means. Particularly with men. My pastor is called Adam. Many of you know him. And I thought I had a great relationship with my pastor. And we shared on a significant level. But during that time, I realized that actually I didn't know as much as I thought that I knew about being accountable. And being realistic in my sharing. And being honest. And it may shock you that I use language that you wouldn't want to hear on a Sunday with my pastor. To demonstrate is the only way I could communicate how crap I felt. And how I needed that support. But having someone who you can share with, share life with, that you know is not going to sit in judgment, is not going to throw solutions at you, is not going to try and fix the problem, but is just there for you to hear your story, to walk with you on that journey. And I don't particularly like the phrase processing, but to be with you as you figure out life. For me, that is absolutely key. So, if I was going to give you some takeaways. Sure. Yeah. Where have they gone? So meditation, which included prayer, scripture, worship, music, mindfulness, breathing, relaxation techniques. Number 3 was exercise, which was with another good friend called Horrier. He's my personal trainer. And that was pad and glove work. Taking it out on Horrier and his gloves. And again, he was another guy. He didn't really get the faith side, but he understood everything else that I was sharing with him. Medication, and then fellowship, which was friends, family, and my therapist. So the takeaways, know yourself. No, don't just, if you're like me and a fella and you wake up and you feel out of sorts, just try and figure it out. What's the emotion behind it? What's not right? Explore it. If what you do already, your coping mechanisms begin to fail, The stuff that you normally do, exercise, talking with friends, sport, reading, relaxation, swimming, plane spotting, train spotting, whatever you do that helps you manage the stress in your life, if they no longer work, or a number of them no longer work, think of it like the engine management light coming in, that actually you need to look closely as to what is happening. Seek help. Colleagues, trusted friends, people perhaps that are sat in this room. And in encouragement, recognize that post-traumatic growth is real. We often talk about post-traumatic stress, normal reaction to an abnormal event. Everyone goes through that. Post-traumatic stress disorder or injury, yes, that's real too. But actually, you can come out the other side. That's why I choose to call it post-traumatic stress injury, because it's an injury. You can recover from an injury. You say disorder, you think you're stuck with it for life. I was injured. I'm well again. And I'm actually better than I was before. My calling is completely shaped by what I do. I don't have the anger anymore. Last few moments. When I was policing, I mentioned that I was calm, brought a calming influence to pretty much every situation I went into. I would often go into a domestic disturbance and talk it down. Go into a place with weapons, they put their weapons down. I wasn't known for my anger, but I longed for someone to say in the back of the car, if you weren't in that uniform right now, we'd sort it out man to man. Because that's what sometimes the bad guys in the back say. My response was, I was secretly praying for someone to say that. So I could step out, take my body armour off, take my baton and cuffs off and my CS spray, oik them out the back and give them what for. Now, I wouldn't have been here, I wouldn't have been drawing my pension if that had happened. Those thoughts have completely gone. I'm still nice Nigel. And to close with, what foundation are you building on? Where are your fixings? Where are your foundations? Where are your roots? When it gets tough, where are you drawing from? Are they shallow? Are they superficial? Or are they deep? And although my faith was shaken, the roots went deep enough. The foundations went deep enough to carry me through that storm of post-traumatic stress injury and depression. That even in the darkest times, there was that hope, that promise that was before me within that. Hey, listen, we're in a church. I ought to close with something from the Bible, really. That's the tradition, isn't it, Denver? You got to share something like that. Well, I have it in my notes here, but where's it gone? I don't know. Old Testament, a guy called Isaiah wrote, "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, don't be troubled, don't be stressed. For I am your God, I will strengthen you. Yes, I will help you. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Yes, I will help you." And sometimes we have to recognize that as men, we don't have all the strength. There is something that we don't have, and we have to look beyond that. And lastly, and in closing, Jesus, in the words of Matthew 11, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." For me, that is the key. That in Jesus there is that rest, there is that peace, there is that hope, there is that place of safety, of refuge, of sanctuary in a world that throws all sorts at us. And yeah, you might need other stuff to help you through that. But if you're building your life on Jesus, that's a great place to be in any storm that comes your way.
As men, this is why we do gather on this journey on the 3rd and 4th of November again, why we gather once a month. It's okay to say that I'm not okay. And I think as men, sometimes it's one of the slowest things that we do. Honesty, again, is best policy. I was writing some things down, not on my social media when you were kind of speaking to us. But as you know, again, he's touched on suicide. And, 3,899 people died of suicide last year. 2022, and I've said these figures to you before. 75% of these were men, and 75%, 1 in 5 men have suicidal thoughts regular. 1 in 5 men have suicidal thoughts regular. And, the power is in reaching out. That's the aspect, is reaching out to somebody, being able to be honest with somebody, because I believe it's vitally important for us to kind of stand together. Sometimes we have healthy, unhealthy coping mechanisms, self-meditate kind of thing, meditate of things that are kind of medications. Sometimes it can be porn, it can be anger, it can be drink, it can be drugs, it can be sports sometimes, it can be cars, it can be things that we do to almost kind of, instead of dealing with it, we just shove it off to one side. And again, as men, I think it's vitally important for us to be able to be honest and be open and be real. It's interesting because I wrote, as he was sharing what he kind of put, I thought, God is a dismantler. I'm sure, all of us, I did mechanicking for quite a number of years, and I know people in here have done different things. And, when you start out in life and younger and you get your qualifications, you get your certificate, you put it on the wall, and that's it. You think you've made yourself for life. That's a way of making money. And unfortunately, life happens to us, doesn't it? Balls come out of left field, because there's a thing called learned knowledge, and then there's lived knowledge, lived experience. People that have been on drink and drugs, and people that have been involved with violence and other situations, they form communities that are kind of lived experience lives. It's something they've lived through. But actually, many times in churches, we get hid behind information and religion. And whereas really we need to pull that mask off and realize that, it's about the lived experience of life. There's nothing wrong with, living an experience, whether it's police, whether it's, the aspect of in a football situation, maybe it's in a restaurant situation or a takeaway situation, maybe it's retired. Maybe it's in a school situation, maybe it's laying tar, it could be gardening, whatever situations we all find ourselves in, building houses, whatever it is we find out, even as a pastor of a church, there's times that I've got to take layers off because God is into dismantling us and disarming us. Because many ways, the reason why the enemy can attack us is because we arm the enemy by arming ourselves instead of disarming ourselves, which then disarms the enemy as well on that. And, Adam, has been a great friend to me over the past couple of years, for a number of years, but over the past couple of years. And he asked the questions, how's are you into pornography? Are you lying? Are you cheating? Are you stealing? That kind of thing. Are you being honest with yourself? Are you being honest with others? You're taking time out for yourself. He asked the real pertinent questions. And we don't meet too often because it wouldn't be right to meet too often. But when we do meet, it's purposeful. It might be for an hour. It might be for an hour and a half. It might just be over a meal. It might be over a coffee. But it's getting somebody that's disconnected and is not maybe a pal, buddy that sits around with you and maybe they see something that's not right, but actually have they got the guts to actually say to you about it? Sometimes they don't want to upset their friendship they've got with you. Sometimes they want to pat you on the back, or sometimes it's hard when you are in a situation to actually be open and honest. Even though you want to be honest, sometimes it's hard to be open and be bare. And I've got one or two others that are very similar to that as pastoral leaders, but Adam especially on that journey. So, and we do have that email, men@newlifeeden.org. If you need to reach out, if you want to do it, confidentially, privately, again, it comes into us. Or there's Nigel, he's got his business cards there, again, an email, and any way you want to reach out. Because, one of the things that the lie of the enemy is I'm okay. I'm okay, Jack. I'm okay, pal. And I can do it my way. Or I'll do it in my own way. And I've done that for years. I thought I could do it all my own way, in my own strength. But I had to realize that actually there was trauma. Actually, there was pride. Actually, there was arrogance. Actually, in many ways, there was anger. But yet I'd bottle it up or hide it, or hide behind a pulpit, or hide behind a portion of scripture, or hide behind a dog collar, or hide behind a wife or a husband or a situation or circumstances that are around us, maybe behind, kind of success, or maybe behind failures, maybe behind a best friend. But really, the dismantling process is what we're about as men. And I think this is why we gather, as men, is that we can, kind of dismantle the situations that we go through. And I love the fact there it says, we may not know the answer to why, but we do know who, and his name is Jesus. So.